Caribbean island, once home to a powerful industry and a divided people.
They set fire to the one thing that the company really, really cares about.
An isolated ghost town in America where dreams were made.
This was simply not something you would expect to see 11,000 feet up. It demonstrates just how much wealth there was here.
A waterlogged stronghold off England's coast, born from a time of fear.
At face value, it looks like something from Mad Max meets Waterworld. What's it doing there?
And in the Mediterranean, an ancient village caught in the crossfire.
Neighbor feared neighbor. The atmosphere had changed. It had become dangerous.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. High in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, USA, is a land of shattered dreams.
It's strikingly beautiful, and on a sunny day, it's even idyllic. But you can't help but wonder what this place looks like in the winter.
For anyone living out here, you have to be pretty resilient. The weathers here are fierce. Snowstorms, avalanches, freezing cold temperatures.
It's not the normal place you'd expect people to put buildings, so there must have been a good reason for them to be there.
From above, it's clear that there was more to the site than the structures still standing today.
As you come closer, you see the outlines of streets, you see the foundations of old buildings.
Clearly, lots of effort was put into some of these. You've got some sort of quite ornate wooden structures, some really quite nice buildings.
And others have seen better days. They look as if they've been destroyed by some other outside factor.
What promise of riches first lured settlers to this inhospitable land?
There must have been something that we can't see, something hidden from view that made all this effort and construction worthwhile. But what was it, and where did it go?
David Singer is a preservation expert and helps to look after what's left of the site.
So this building is a jail. It was built in 1882. This was law and order on the frontier. Buildings made of wood, but the planks are laid flat, so the walls are all 6 inches thick. People would try and break out of the jail, of course, but people would try and break into the jail if they wanted to have their own kind of vigilante justice. And, you know, law and order was here, but it was also taken into your own hands occasionally.
In the mid-19th century, the United States was a land gripped by wild optimism and naked greed. This place was a part of that story.
Once the federal government opened up this land to Western settlement, it opened the floodgates. Suddenly, Americans were coming in from the East Coast and immigrants were coming from other countries to seize whatever opportunity this land had for them.
Untamed frontiers like this were where fortune seekers chased the elusive American dream.
It's impossible to overestimate how inhospitable an area this is. In 1884, a 23-day blizzard dumped 25 feet of snow on the region. People had to dig tunnels just to get from building to building.
But what these people wanted was worth the terrible hardship.
The San Juan Mountains form part of the Colorado mineral belt, and this is an area that's famous for hard rock ores caused by mineralization associated with volcanic activity. And what you find is that this volcanic activity caused veins of gold, silver, lead, copper-rich material to be intruded into the rocks around them. But it's actually very, very hard to get this material out because it's in the solid geology.
As early as 1873, some groups had started to explore the Animas River, and gold and silver deposits were discovered pretty early on. Log cabins started to sprout up, scattered all around the place, and within a year or so, the Animas River area had become a central focus of hard rock, silver, and gold mining.
This is Animas Forks, a remote mining boomtown built on the promise of precious metals.
This would have been the main street area. There were two streets, Little Street and Hanson. This area would have been bustling with miners going to work in the mills and the mines, carts full of equipment and materials, kids playing, children going off to school.
Perched at around 11,000 feet, this was one of the highest altitude mining towns in the country.
Animas Forks became a substantial town over time, but it really began to see some of its biggest development after the sawmill and lumber mill were created. The sawmill was producing over 4,000 pieces of board a day just so that it could accommodate the number of people who were here at the time.
Within 3 years, there were 30 cabins, a general store, several saloons, a pharmacy, and a post office.
It even had the Kalamazoo Hotel, which was the grandest and largest building in the area. It also had the town's only telephone and this beautiful grand piano. Animas Forks was a bustling metropolis.
In 1882, the Animas Forks Pioneer began publication, and it was the highest altitude printing press in the US at the time. Clearly, this town was in it for the long haul.
At its height, 400 people called this place home. For one family drawn here, theirs was a story that captured the reality of what towns like this were really all about.
When the Duncans moved here in the late 1870s, they were considering this to be a place that was going to grow and develop and become a full-fledged town. And so they built a home that was commensurate with modern living in the Victorian era. The amazing views out into the mountains from this bay window were unrivaled for this kind of living, having a bit of culture while you were kind of on the frontier as a pioneer.
This was simply not something you would expect to see 11,000 feet up the side of a steep mountain, and it demonstrates just how much wealth there was to be made here.
But pride comes before a fall. And soon the Duncans and other townspeople would learn that lesson the hard way.
The town's boom period came to a sudden end on October 22nd, 1891. A huge fire burned down most of the business district, causing over $20,000 in damage.
The fire actually originated in the Kalamazoo House kitchen, and then it ultimately ended up spreading throughout the rest of the town. And to add insult to injury, mining had already begun to taper, and so with these two things together, this was a really crucial moment for the people of Animas Forks.
Only 5 years after they had arrived, the Duncans left Animas Forks, their dream of striking it rich in tatters. But not everyone packed their belongings in such a hurry.
The town kind of lay fallow for a while until it was revived again sometime after 1904, when the Gold Prince mill was being constructed. This is a gravity-fed mill, and so that's why you're seeing the foundation of this large building tiered as they did things to the ore to process it.
At its peak, it had a 500-ton per day capacity, and it was fed ore by this incredibly impressive 12,600-foot aerial tramway.
And so this does reinvigorate life at Animas Forks, and it does begin to draw more investors and more people back to this town.
But making a living out here balanced on a constant knife edge.
Things were going swimmingly and looked like things were improving a lot in this area until, unfortunately, the owners of the Gold Prince Mill went bankrupt in 1907.
When it was no longer profitable, the town's days were numbered.
After the Gold Prince Mill closed down in 1910, people moved on, and there was some sporadic repopulation here in the 20s and then the 60s, but the town was never occupied again.
For centuries, the pursuit of gold has driven humankind mad with greed. A hard life of feast or famine that shaped not only the landscape, but the world we live in today.
It might seem that the story of Animas Forks is just another story of a boomtown gone bust. And sure, in many ways it is. But it's also a story of lives made, lives lost in the process, and we shouldn't forget that part of it.
Off England's southern coast, in the waters of the Solent, is a structure born in an age of fear.
The first time I ever saw this, I was sailing out of Portsmouth through the Solent, and there, up ahead of us, what looked like it was an island. And we got closer, and can't be an island, it's too round.
Its state of decay suggests this is no modern construction.
This is really falling to pieces. The concrete is crumbling, all the metal is corroded. This has clearly been through some really tough years.
Inside is a labyrinth of dark passages.
And as you explore further, you can see that there's a whole series of interconnecting corridors, some of which are so tight you have to squeeze past. It's a real claustrophobic environment.
Its unobstructed views of the surrounding waters are clearly key to its original purpose. But would it ever be called into action?
That rather unique circular design is a really crucial clue as to what was going on here. Another important factor to consider is that there are other emplacements just like it.
There's been a lot of thought put into this very tightly knit, very strong structure. Did it actually serve its purpose?
In times of war, the United Kingdom has always had the advantage of being an island nation. This hulking mass of concrete was a vital part of the strategy to ward off foreign invaders.
So there are a number of things that are built on top of it that are clearly from World War II. There are outposts, there's a place to put guns. I mean, it's very reminiscent of many of the structures that we see along this coastal part of the UK.
Dom Hones lives on the mainland and is an expert on this unique slice of history.
We're downstairs in the cartridge cellar, which is the lower basement floor of the fort. And quite simply, down here was where all of the ammunition was initially stored before it was taken up to the higher levels, to the gun emplacements, to be used. These stores here would have been absolutely packed in different sizes of shells, depending on the size of the gun. But literally, they would, line up against the wall and were filled up in this space so the soldiers could come and get them. But literally, an absolute massive firepower in every one of these stores.
The entire fort stood on top of a powder keg. But the design of these lower levels aimed to minimize the risks.
If you had an accident here and an explosion here, it would be absolutely catastrophic. Having lots of different rooms, very thick walls around them as well, meant that, if there was a problem or an explosion, it would limit the damage. You wouldn't lose sort of the entire basement floor.
Clearly, this structure was designed for war. But it doesn't seem strong enough to withstand the extraordinary firepower marshaled by the Nazis.
This was not something that could withstand the type of warfare that was waged in World War II. I mean, you could either just bomb it from the air, or you could hit it with heavy shells from a warship.
But these structures from World War II, are these built on something that pre-existed? And is that the key to what this place used to be used for?
A century before Hitler's forces terrorized Europe, the threat of invasion came from much closer to home.
In the old days, England's ancient enemy was France. And of the continental powers, France is the closest one. It's only a few miles across the English Channel from Britain.
Construction here began in 1861. A time of heightened tension caused by an ambitious French family dynasty with a score to settle.
France's new leader was Napoleon Bonaparte III, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte, who had fought an epic battle against Britain before finally facing defeat at Trafalgar and Waterloo. You can imagine why his descendant might hold just a little bit of a grudge against the British.
The Prime Minister at the time, Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston, was a very popular man, and he decreed that it would be useful to set up a series of defences against any potential attack from the sea.
There was good reason to think an attack was imminent. The French were embarking on an aggressive shipbuilding program, technologically advanced and unparalleled in its might.
The French military was developed so that they had, ironclad warships, including Le Gouin.
Britain had yet to develop an equivalent armored warship. Its aging wooden fleet didn't stand a chance.
The Le Gouin was a major threat to Britain. Palmerston knew that the French ironclad could sail right up a Royal Navy fleet and that the cannons of those ships could do very little to dent the ironclad hull. Britain was put on the back foot almost overnight. The ironclad was a kind of undefeatable superweapon.
In response, Palmerston ordered a royal commission to assess the United Kingdom's ability to repel foreign invaders. Its findings spread panic.
If you can't get the Royal Navy to suddenly convert to ironclads, you've got to defend the Royal Navy's ports with something else. You've got to defend them using armored fortresses instead.
This is HSE Sand Fort, one of a chain of 4 sea-based defenses intended to protect the key naval position of Portsmouth from French attack. In today's money, each stronghold cost around £40 million. And they were part of a far larger nationwide plan that would come to define Palmerston's time in office.
It's difficult to build at sea at the best of time. You imagine how hard it must have been in the 1860s. And what they would do is they would sail these preformed concrete blocks out to the site and drop them to form the foundations on the sea floor and build up from there. And eventually you can build up out of the sea and build the structure of these fortresses.
Above the foundation was the basement level, divided radially into compartments for ammunition. The outermost passage was designed to allow additional armor to be bolted on to the exterior of the fort. When completed in 1880, there was enough firepower stored inside to sink any approaching fleet.
So here we have one of the gun emplacements. There would have been 49 in total, 25 on one level, 24 on the other. And this is where the main gun emplacements were and the main firepower for the forts. Originally been up to 12.5-inch rifle muzzle loading guns, huge sort of 38-ton guns. In a period of battle, all of these guns would be fully manned, up to 600 soldiers maximum capacity on the fort, and they would be running around with ammunition running, getting loading, getting ready to fire, reload, and a huge amount of effort, and that would have all gone on here.
On the fort's upper levels, the troops kept a round-the-clock watch for any approaching enemy.
The way that these forts were designed was that they created a line of defence across the entire Solent that the French Navy would have to pass through in order to get to the shore. Had they attempted to get through, they would have had to come through between Sand Fort and No Man's Fort, and they would have been obliterated from all angles, and every area, stretch of water in between would have been covered. When the alarm sounded, which could have been any time of day or night, the soldiers had to, stop whatever they were doing and take the call to arms.
But that call to arms never came.
In the early 20th century, the dynamics of Britain's relationship to its continental allies shifted dramatically. The unification of Germany really changed the equation on the continent.
Lord Palmerston gears up for French attack that never comes. The crisis in relations with the French passes, and in fact, the French and the British come together in the middle of the 19th century and are as close allies as two nations can be for decades.
For the man that ordered construction of the forts, these defenses became a damning part of his legacy.
The official title is the Solent Forts, but while they were built, they were given a different name by a derisive press. They were called Palmerston's Follies.
And Palmerston's ambitious defense-building program didn't end there. Across the south coast, more than 80 forts were commissioned. To this day, it is still the single most expensive military project undertaken by Britain during peacetime.
Palmerston saw a potential threat from France. With hindsight, you might say that Lord Palmerston was foolish to build all of those fortresses with a massive investment of national wealth, but only with hindsight.
Even after the fort was repurposed for use in the First and then Second World War, the guns stayed silent.
There has never been a shot fired in anger from Sand. The closest they got to it was during World War II, when one of the French warships sought refuge in Portsmouth, and that's the only time the cannons and the forts were targeted on that ship, just to ensure its safe passage into the harbour.
A decade after the world's deadliest conflict ended, the fort was decommissioned. It still stands empty, an ocean albatross, motivated by fear. But Sand Fort may yet be given a renewed purpose.
If you can turn these old forts into something nice, there is potential to make a lot of money. A lot of old British military office buildings, fortresses, have been turned into luxury apartments. And there's no reason why, if you can't work out the transport problems, you couldn't do that with these fortresses as well.
On Puerto Rico's southern shores, stand the remains of a fallen giant.
As you approach from the water, you see what looks like a Caribbean paradise. But as you get closer, you see the vast ruins of some kind of big industrial enterprise.
There's conveyor belts and chutes and chimneys. There's a massive pier heading out into the water. Obviously, we're taking something away. There's some transportation involved. But what was it for?
Surrounding the industrial zone are clues that this operation was even bigger than it first appears.
There's also signs that there's a typical town here. There's all sorts of little buildings, different shapes and sizes, some very domestic, some clearly for the community.
You see what looks like it might have been a hotel. Everything built for those tropical conditions with large verandas, lots of big windows for the breezes to blow through.
But the layout of this town suggests not all was as it seemed.
Whatever this place was, you can see that it obviously housed a lot of people, but there appears to be something off with it.
You can spot that there's two very, very different standards of living.
It almost seems like there was something dividing this town, but what was it? And where have all the people gone?
The rusting structures that cling to the landscape today were once the beating heart of this island. Wilfredo Santiago lives nearby and is fascinated by this rundown site's past.
So at its height, this facility was basically creating tons of this product that was in super high demand.
Basically sustained the economy of the country for almost 100 years. So right now we're standing at the central office. It was basically filled with desks, a lot of processes, a lot of paperwork. It was the central hub of information. Every process went through here. So most of the workforce here in the central office were Americans. They were the figures of power.
For 4 centuries, Puerto Rico had been a Spanish colony. But as the 19th century drew to a close, a new superpower emerged that would change the course of the island's history.
In 1898, a very short but intense war started between Spain and the United States. Within a year, Spain had decided there was no way they could win this war, and they actually granted the island of Puerto Rico to the United States. A lot of Americans saw Puerto Rico as a wonderful opportunity for investment.
So Ford & Co., that's not the car people, a different Ford, acquired the land here. And with it, they decided to invest a huge amount of money in order to make an even bigger amount of money.
Everything was centered around and everything came to be because of one commodity, sugar.
These are the ruins of Central Aguirre, a company town built on sweet white gold.
The employees worked sun to sun, what they called sol a sol. It was basically 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And a lot of people, there was no transportation. So if you live pretty far away from the area, you had to walk 1 hour, 2 hours to get here. So you were losing almost all your life working for a misery.
Profit was everything, and the surrounding neighborhood grew to support the booming industry.
You can't run a place like this just on a factory. You need all the extra supporting stuff. You need a town. Hospitals, schools, places to worship. It had the lot absolutely tied to the factory at its heart.
By establishing these communities around the factories, factory owners were helping to ensure a consistent and stable labor force that, in exchange for providing basic amenities and housing, they hoped they could get a certain sense of loyalty from their workers and ensure that they were consistently showing up to do the job that they had on hand.
So in the early 20th century, the aguirre plantation became the focus of a lot of very modern industrialization. They realized if they could get the cane from the fields to the plant, crushed and processed, and loaded onto ships with the fewest human hands possible, that would be the most cost-effective way to run the whole operation.
By 1920, production increased to record levels, generating over $5 million per year. The population here swelled to almost 6,000, mostly employees of Central Aguirre. But for the workers, a dark side would soon be revealed.
In theory, providing this community for workers is utopian. But if we actually look at the site, we see that there is segregation that runs rampant in this facility.
Where the American overseers lived in these lovely houses, they socialized strictly among themselves, and they had the best of everything. The people from Puerto Rico who lived there lived in very modest housing.
The accommodation was of such poor construction, little of it survives to be seen today.
So here, it's not just about civil planning, making life beautiful for everybody. There's a hierarchy and there's apartheid. You've got one area that's for the Americans and you've got the other area that's for the locals.
This division didn't stop at the housing. At the American hotel, the deep-seated prejudice was painfully clear.
It got to a point that if a Puerto Rican snuck in or walked in and got into the pool, they would completely dry it out and clean it so they can refill it. They basically had this idea that we Puerto Ricans were dirty, we're unhygienic, and we were filthy.
For more than 3 decades, the sugar mill thrived and profits soared. But it was all at the expense of the workers, segregated on their own island. In time, the employees would fight back against the poor wages and mistreatment.
Beginning on the 26th of December 1934, a wave of strikes sets off across Puerto Rico. And this has huge implications for the sugar processing industry. They set fire to the one thing that the company really, really cares about in order to get people to pay attention.
You have a number of workers who destroyed about 2,900 cords of sugar cane at an enormous loss to the factory and the factory owners. This was particularly catastrophic, but it was effective in that they were able to negotiate some better terms.
Over the next decade, it's a constant battle to improve workers' rights and conditions, balanced up against the new machinery that's being brought in.
It was not until they started to unionize and, fight for the right for more money and more equal pay that when they started getting a little bit more stable in the whole community.
But their hard-won rights didn't last for long. Despite continual efforts to modernize production, the sugar industry here was entering a terminal decline.
By the mid-60s, the boom was ending. The end of the road was becoming visible. The price of sugar was collapsing.
The American owners effectively abandoned the town, and it's taken on by the sort of local and national government. But by 1993, the writing was on the wall. This was not a profit-making town anymore. And the factory closed, and with it, the town just fell apart.
Today, the abandoned company town is no more than a ghost of Puerto Rico's colonial past.
One of the first global trades that really affected normal people wasn't gold, it wasn't precious metals, it was sugar.
It's fascinating to see the remnants of what was once this thriving industry, and also to understand the degree of exploitation that was involved in this business.
In the eastern Mediterranean Sea, on the island of Cyprus, is a collection of ruins tainted by tragedy.
Among some pretty hills is a stone village. This is not fancy, but it is absolutely clear from the way this has survived that the people who built this place built well. They built to last.
Some stone stairways are still visible, and windows and doors give an idea of what the place used to look like.
The odd assemblage of buildings, they could date from almost any era. Some look quite old, some look less old.
The sense you get from all of this is that this is a place that's been inhabited down the ages and potentially by different cultures.
And yet the people are all gone, and this whole area would have been cultivated, and yet now it's empty.
What story of sorrow weighs heavy on this land? And why is this village now abandoned?
There was an underlying divide in the country, which had been bubbling away for decades, came to the surface in the most violent and shocking way.
For many locals, traditional Christian belief lies at the heart of their community. Christodoulos Papaminas is a farmer in the neighboring village. He fondly remembers the simple way of life here.
Αυτή ήταν η ζωή τους, είχαν περβολούκια από τα πάνω, από τα κάτω, έβαλαν, ζούσαν, κάλαν το προς το ζήν, είχαν από όλα να εφηδεύκασαν, από όλα.
In time, events on the island would tear this village apart. A single building holds the key to its sudden abandonment.
Εδώ είναι η τζαμί τους, τους Κοκύπριους, που έρχονταν και εκείνοι έκαναν τη θρησκεία τους που έχουν. Έρχονταν, ξέρω εγώ, να που κάμναν, τα με τζαμί καμιά φορά εμείς, καμιά φορά.
If we've got a mosque here in the village, this is a sign that this might have been not a Greek Orthodox village, but a Turkish Muslim village. And in the history of Cyprus, in the recent history of Cyprus, that's significant.
Cyprus has for many years been a country made up of two groups, the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. The Greek Cypriots are predominantly Christian Orthodox, whereas the Turkish Cypriots are predominantly Muslim. For many, many years, they lived happily side by side.
This is Foinikas, a once idyllic Mediterranean village. Within living memory, it was home to 235 people. Yet life here was not always peaceful.
Cyprus enjoys a really strategic location, and because of its key position in the Mediterranean and because of its relatively flourishing economy and its good natural harbors, Cyprus was battled over by the powers for centuries. The Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, the Turks.
These run-down walls are evidence of one of the earliest occupying forces.
In the 12th century, the Knights Templar called this place home. They built the village from stones from the nearby vertical rock faces.
During the violent era of the Crusades, the Knights Templar protected European Christian travelers visiting sites in the Muslim-controlled Holy Land.
The Templars want to control Cyprus because it will enable them to strengthen their control of Middle Eastern trade routes. So the Knights Templar build what they call a commandery, that is a command post here in this village.
It may have been founded at a time of religious conflict, but as the centuries passed, people here learnt to live together. Over the years of trading with fellow cattlemen, Christodoulos made many friends.
Ο Μουσταφάς είχε κοπάει, ο Σμάιλος, ο πατέρας του Μουσταφά, οι φίλοι μας ούλοι ήταν κτηνοτρόφοι και γεωργοί. Δεν είχαν με καφετέρια, με παρποντών, τίποτε άλλο. secondo da poprene sasante su gestus, dinallimando di goli. Enge degli olido, chiolindisi, horgu.
But trouble was brewing. The religious tensions, central to the holy wars of the Crusades, resurfaced hundreds of years later.
So this growing tension between the Greek Christians and the Turkish Muslims explodes into open warfare in 1974 when the Greek government, led by a military junta, decides, you know, we're going to annex the island of Cyprus because it's largely Greek, it belongs to Greece.
Το πραξικόπημα που έξεραμε, ακούσαμε το πρωί ότι είναι πραξικόπημα. Όπως άκουσε όλος ο κόσμος, ξέρει κανένας ότι είναι πραξικόπημα.
Turkey's response to the Greek Cypriot nationalist coup d'etat is to seek to protect the Turks of Cyprus by invading Cyprus.
The island descended into violent chaos. In the fog of war, both sides were guilty of committing unforgivable atrocities.
Now, neighbour feared neighbour. The atmosphere had changed. It had become dangerous. What once had been a peaceful landscape of coexistence had been shattered. It's such a waste.
After 30 days of bitter fighting, a ceasefire was agreed. Soon after, the country was divided.
And as a condition of the ceasefire, there were massive population transfers. Tens of thousands of Greek Christians migrated from the now Turkish zone in the north of the island to the now Greek zone in the south of the island, and the same thing happened on the other side.
This village on the south of the island was now part of Greek-held territory.
The civilians of Phoenikas were caught in the middle of the chaos and had to decide what to do. It had been a Turkish village for years, but now they were being told that they're on the wrong side of the border.
Fearing reprisals, the Muslim occupants fled. Christodoulos remembers only too well the trauma of this terrible period.
Είναι μεγάλη η θλίψη για τους ανθρώπους. Μεγάλη θλίψη. Νομίζω που χάσαν δικούς τους και χάσαν και τις περιουσίες τους. Δεν μπορεί κανένας να το ξεχάσει το πράγμα ή να το... σκέφτεσαι το και θλίβεσαι. Οι Τούρκοι τούτοι να ζήσουν τα μέσα. Στα ζήσει. Αυτά.
Over 4 decades have passed since the shocking events that transformed this Mediterranean island. Yet, Cyprus is still a country divided.
The Turks of northern Cyprus are convinced that if they let their guard down for even a moment, the Greeks will take over. The Greeks of Cyprus are convinced that if they let their guard down for even a moment, the Turks will take over. And the partition of Cyprus remains part of the daily life of that island to this day.